As President Marcos Jr. prepares for his third State of the Nation address, more voices are joining the chorus, calling on him to use the occasion to announce an outright ban on Philippine offshore gaming operators, or POGOs. What drew POGOs to the Philippines in the first place under Rodrigo Duterte? Where does the money that funds them come from? And what explains their staying power 2 years after Duterte left office? Hello, I'm John Nery, and you are in the Public Square. Dr. Alvin Camba is the leading scholar on the effects of China's rise on the global south. This has led him to study, among many other important topics, the flow of capital, both licit and illicit, in Asia. He was an assistant professor at the University of Denver and is now a newly appointed research advisor at Associated Universities Incorporated. He continues to teach at the Fletcher School in Tufts University. And he's zooming in from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Camba, and thank you for joining us in the Public Square.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Camba, you served as an expert witness in the Senate inquiry into POGOs. But before Mayor Alice Guo came into the picture, you said POGOs have given legal cover to scam operations. When did this start, and does it apply to all or most or just some of the POGOs?
So I basically have two answers for this. I think the first one is we never really had good knowledge of, let's say, how POGO operations work. Like when we think about Philippine regulators or even researchers such as myself, we never really had sort of an understanding of how do POGOs make money, who are their targets, how big is the market, who are the people running these companies, and whether they're legal or illegal. We actually don't know that. For people like myself who have done research on this, what we know is that online gambling has always been illegal in the People's Republic of China, in China. And for many people in the Chinese-speaking world, or people who basically are reading Chinese news or plug into sort of what's happening in sort of the greater China world, meaning China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, even Singapore, online gambling has always been a menace to society. It's always been run by criminal enterprises, etc., even if it's actually moved to Southeast Asia. Now, the business model originally was to target potential gamblers and hooking them up into getting addicted into online gambling. Eventually, once they're addicted into online gambling, you get them to sort of put in a huge sum of their money, and then you end up rigging the game so you can channel that money away from, let's say, the gambler into sort of the criminal enterprises. That model disappeared largely during the pandemic, by and large because, number one, the Chinese government made labor exports, exporting Chinese laborers into countries like the Philippines very difficult. So during the pandemic, worldwide the global economies has closed down. The borders have been very difficult to cross. As a result, Chinese laborers, which, as you know, during the third, one of the biggest source of, let's say, labor imports from the global from outside, it actually dwindled a lot. So when labor imports went down in the Philippines, specifically for Chinese gamblers, and then within China, the Chinese government made operations of online gambling very difficult. That many of these operations, these POGOs, these online gambling firms, shifted their operations. They started to target Westerners, or people in Europe, people in Southeast Asia, etc. Now they basically have the scam compound model, wherein they lure people into, let's say, a romantic relationship. And then once these people invest a lot of money into sort of once these people have a romantic relationship, the scammer gets the victim to invest a lot of money in a platform, and then they basically end up taking up all these investments, leaving the victim behind. It's a different business model, but both of them are scams. Safe to say, during the pandemic, the business model changed, and I would say that right now, probably most of the operations are actually scam operations.
So it was during the pandemic that the business models changed, the original business model made it susceptible to the kind of scam operations that we are now looking at?
The original business model is pretty much the same, except you target a different population. You target Chinese speakers. You basically target Chinese gamblers, and you have sort of a similar sort of like, let's say, support system. You have programmers, you have blockchain analysts, you have people who steal information online, except they target a different population. So John, think of it as one business model, just a different type. They're just targeting China. Before they used to target Chinese speakers, now they target everybody else.
Since your testimony at the Senate hearings, Alice Guo has become the talk of the town. No? Were you surprised at how things turned out? Or did you sort of anticipate this, that maybe the next step for these companies was, after gaining legal cover, was to win political cover?
Right. Thank you for this question. So I don't think this is, in my view, this wasn't surprising. Maybe Alice Guo herself becoming a national sort of like icon. I'm a bit afraid that she's going to become too popular, and then she comes back and she runs to be a senator. And in the Philippines, we have a history of like, people who are vilified becoming heroes and taking a political position. So that's actually a very like scary outcome. But I don't think it's surprising. In the Philippines, we never really had a good system of, let's say, tracking individuals. We know how corrupt our bureaucracies are. It's very possible to sell citizenship, possible to sell land easily, possible to sort of like fake documents. When I studied Chinese companies and Chinese investors in the Philippines, what I did one time, and I actually have the database, is I basically created what you call a Chinese shareholder database, shareholder investment database in the Philippines.
Okay.
So basically, I accumulated around 9 to 11,000 companies from the Security Exchange Commission. Each of these companies have a Chinese investor, shareholder in the particular firm, and you can actually see whether their names, their addresses, and you can actually see their where they come from in China or Hong Kong or Macau. Now, interesting enough, in the shareholder database, let's say I look at one company, and you can see articles of incorporation, let's say 1 year, then you can look at it the next year, then you can look at it the year after. What's interesting is that a very common pattern I see in my database is that after 1 or 2 years of investing, many of these Chinese investors become Philippine citizens after. And you can actually see it in the articles of incorporation. Let's say between, let's say, 1990 to 1995. By 1995, the Chinese citizen now becomes a Philippine citizen. And it's very easy to say that this is a Chinese citizen because of the name of the investor. So given that this has been a pattern in the Philippines, I sort of don't see it to be surprising that some of this, that you have an Alice Guo who actually ended up to become a mayor. I bet a lot of these criminals have been using this as a pattern, not just in scam compounds or online gambling. They've probably been doing this, since the 90s, I would say, probably mining to any sort of business. And I would say there are probably other mayors like this in the Philippines, if not mayors, some sort of like small official. And maybe if not a mayor, even like a normal citizen who has all the rights of a Filipino person to actually invest and do legitimate business in the Philippines. Now, what's interesting with your question is that was this a next step, gaining political cover? Maybe it's a yes and a no, that I don't think this was a pattern for all the criminal enterprises, but I think this, at least for this particular group of people, this particular organization, this was a strategy to sort of like safeguard their investment. And as we know from the findings of Senator Hontiveros and I think Senator Gatchalian, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right, yeah. Sherwin.
Yeah, Sherwin. You actually, she went to Grace Christian. She was somebody I could have met when in Metro Manila when I was younger. She went to Grace Christian. Her family probably moved to the Philippines when she was around 10, and she speaks very fluent Tagalog. So it's not completely illogical that you would find people like this to be becoming facilitators of the criminal enterprises. And I would say there are probably other people like her, not just in her networks, maybe in other networks as well, other Chinese schools and other Chinese, I would say, communities in, let's say, the Philippines, and Filipino communities as well, not just Chinese.
Dr. Camba, when I first heard her, Alice Guo, testify her first time in the Senate, I came away with the thought that she was possibly a dummy. That she was just somebody there to represent maybe her father or some other business interests. But maybe that picture has become a little more complicated now. What do you think? Is she a dummy? Is she a spy? Is she the mastermind for this particular series of POGO enterprises? And I think there are like 7 or 8 that are used to be based or are now based in Bamban.
It's really hard to say if she's the mastermind or the spy. We are sort of like a dummy. We don't have data for that, right?
That's right.
One thing we can say is that she's very effective. If you put her father in there, her father would not exude the same charisma or sort of like understanding of Philippine habits and Philippine sort of like mannerisms that she actually has mastered over the past 2 or 3 decades. Given that she's grown up in the Philippines, she speaks relatively fluent Tagalog. I've seen people online saying that, oh, that's not fluent. She knows how to win the hearts and minds of, let's say, people in Bamban. I think there's a constituency defending her right now, telling people that, she's originally from Bamban and nobody else can actually say anything. Nobody else can like contest that. I think it's more likely that she's a key part of this enterprise, and she's probably a figurehead. There probably are people behind her. For sure, there are people behind her who control sort of the infrastructure, the financing, or people who have links overseas. Or people who are overseas. That's really more likely.
Yeah.
Now, I'm less convinced of the fact that they're spies by the Chinese government. I'm not super convinced of that narrative. I think one thing about criminal enterprises is that, on the one hand, you can sort of see instances where the Chinese government goes after them and criminalizes them. You can find examples of that in many parts of the world. On the other hand, you can also find instances where many of these organizations become pawns to sort of like the needs of the Chinese government, or let's say the United Front in China. It's a bit of both. The difficulty in researching this is that there are thousands of organizations or thousands of these groups, and we don't know which ones are working with the Chinese government. That's the first issue. And the second issue is that there is also temporal, meaning that there are certain times when the Chinese government can come in and can convince these groups to actually work for them. And I think that's the danger of people like Alice Guo. She probably isn't a spy, and her group isn't a spy. But one of these days, the Chinese government can come in and tell them, look, if you don't do this for us, we're going to persecute you. We're going to like catch all of you. So you have to do this for us in order for us not to do anything to you. And that's a danger of having criminal organizations such as the ones that she probably represents.
So even when the Chinese state government is in constant touch with the Philippine government, warning them about particular personalities, and then in the case of the Bamban raid, actually footing the bill for the deportation of maybe 300 nationals, and even the small Philippine delegation of law enforcers that went with deportees to Shanghai. So even with all of that, it's still possible to think that maybe there's the unseen hand of the state government somewhere else?
Definitely. I think the issue with the Chinese government that we don't know much about in the Philippines and many parts of the world is that it's also extremely decentralized with its own different interests, pushing for different outcomes depending on what their needs are. So even in China, sort of like this research on this research on criminal organizations or who is involved, or let's say issues of like which parts of the state are compromised by these groups. People don't know much, and it's very, very dangerous to research this. I had a friend who was a journalist. I actually don't know if she's still alive, but she's a journalist in China. She and I researched this in 2016 to 2018. We were both doing research. I was doing research in the Philippines. She was doing research in China. And she published this very good article on sort of, let's say, how online gambling works in the Philippines. And I was able to get a lot of information because we worked together. And then by 2020, during the pandemic, she went into hiding under the Ministry of Internal Security, basically witness protection. And up until now, her WeChat account has been deactivated and haven't contacted her ever since. if you talk to Chinese researchers or let's say Chinese academics or people even in the Chinese government, they will give you all sorts of, let's say, legal and official positions that, okay, the Chinese government is against this. And that's probably true in sort of in an official sense. We know that, and I've written this in my paper that I think it's going to be one of your questions. This is when extremely rich Chinese citizens and even officials try to send money outside China. Many of these groups become an independent organizations, become an independent power base upon which this sort of capital from China gets funneled into, and then they get invested in everywhere else. Nonetheless, we cannot deny the fact that despite all this like good sort of like relatively cooperative measures by the Chinese government, we also know that they can be useful. Many of these organizations and these groups can definitely be useful to the Chinese government when certain circumstances happen. It's hard to find data for that, but we can look at history on how this is done. Think about the Japanese Yakuza. This is not China. The Japanese Yakuza back in the 1950s and 1960s, at the time when Japan was relatively weak because it was beaten by the United States in the war. There were potential instances of mass mobilization against the Japanese government. And the Japanese government could not directly step in, and they could not actually come in to like quell these mobilizations. Who comes in to sort of do it for them? It was the Yakuzas. So, and we know it similarly as well in the Philippines. Many of our politicians are involved in criminal enterprises. We know Joseph Estrada and Weteng. We know the Weteng lords of like Luzon, etc. Criminal enterprises are part and parcel of any government or any sort of like political sort of institution. Even China is not like immune from this.
Your research into areas outside of the Philippines, let's say scam hubs in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, what do they tell you about Chinese influence or intervention?
It's very similar as well. The Chinese government, on the one hand, tries to stop these criminal enterprises. On the other hand, they of course try to. On the other hand, their role is much more circumscribed in the way that it's very hard to, let's say, find. You try to foster cooperation between the United States and China. China would automatically just like push it away. Disregard the request, not adhere to the request of like cooperation. Even it's not that different. We published this in the USIB report that came out, I think, in May, where we have a paragraph on like the role of the Chinese government. And I remember as co-authors, there were like 8 of us or 10 of us, I forgot. We actually debated the paragraphs that came out of that like too many times. I'm like, wow, we spent like 2 weeks just talking about this like 4 paragraphs or something. So it's not that it's a long way of saying that we really don't know yet. This is the best that we know. We know that they do both things, and from that we move forward and how to like understand it better.
You're talking about the U.S. Institute of Peace paper, right?
Report.
The
report.
Yeah, the report that just came out.
I wrote the Philippine. I'm one of the co-authors of the report,
right.
And I wrote, of course, the Philippine chapter of that. Yeah.
Maybe we have time later to go back to the role of Beijing, but I wanted to talk about the money that fuels all of this. You studied you made the distinction between 2 kinds of Chinese capital: state-backed and flexible. Can you talk to us about the difference?
Sure. So the way in concept, this is a really old paper in 2020, and honestly, I'm actually quite proud of this paper.
It's only 2020, but it's very old. Okay.
Well, it's old in academia. We always have to try out something new.
Yeah.
So I think I'm trying to remember the argument, but we know that China is a state-backed economy. We know that very well. Like in the academic literature, people have called it like people have talked about state capitalism. You have Germany, you have Japan, you have like you even have state capitalism of, let's say, Saudi Arabia, Singapore. But in China, it's super different because it's not just state capitalism. It's a form of state. It's a party state capitalism. It's a communist state. There's no political turnover in China, unlike in, let's say, in Japan or, let's say, Germany. There's turnover in politics. You always have to elect somebody new, even if those elections are a bit suspect, right? Let's say in the case of Japan, where the LDP remains to be the leader over and over again. Now, And state capital is when you talk about vertically integrated companies that largely relies on, let's say, the People's Bank of China as a way of, let's say, subsidizing its activities. So this is how the Chinese economy works. They rely on what you call financial repression and devaluation of the currency in order to sort of like fuel its sort of like short-term spending. And the reason why we have, let's say, economic crisis right now in China, if you've been watching news, especially in Chinese news, maybe not the news that's like purported by, let's say, propagandistic television or let's say our pro-China influencers in the Philippines who are very, very vocal to that, and they just talk about propaganda all the time with no research at all. I'm tempted to name them, but I'm not gonna name them here.
Maybe that's a whole other show. Okay.
That's another show, but I would love to talk about them. I just was looking at their Facebook before I came here. So there's actually it's a lot of economic slowdown right now in China. Unemployment is very, very high, and Chinese like graduates from universities can't even get jobs simply because many of like the spending that happened in the 90s and the 2000s that they haven't like paid for yet, they're hitting. It's actually hitting them right now.
Okay.
Now that's basically how the Chinese economy works. It's like state-driven, state-backed, and usually they have multiple goals. They have the goals of, let's say, forwarding diplomacy, strengthening the role of, let's say, the Chinese government, the Chinese state in that particular country. They have the role of, let's say, creating what you call short-term economic returns because the Chinese government relies on economic legitimacy in order to prop up its own sort of like power base. Unlike democracies where legitimacy comes from processes, in autocracies like China, legitimacy comes from outcomes, right? So that's basically what the role of the state is. It's or state capital. It's sort of to perform these multiple goals and try to like marry the goals together. In my paper, I basically argue that one of the goals is to make everything legible in the eyes of China. And legibility comes from complicated concept, but the idea is you make it understandable for the Chinese government to pursue its goals in the future. Now, I argue that in any economy, whether it's China or the United States, there is going to be the inevitable process of building a private capital because you are going to have actors who are powerful and they will end up like saving a lot of money in turn in the process. Now, the issue here is that when you save up a lot of money and then you have a state, a government that may go after you, or in this particular case, a permanent party secretary, permanent president who may go after your wealth, you are going to be tempted as a capital holder to send that money elsewhere in order for that money to be safeguarded from the potential whims or the potential mood of, let's say, the dictator or the autocrat. For me, that's what flexible capital is. The goal of flexible capital for me is to extricate itself from the legal political conditions of the People's Republic of China. And basically, it can go somewhere and it can attach itself to, let's say, different legal jurisdictions. Whether it's, let's say, usually the process is they go to offshore financial centers, let's say Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and then from there they basically go to, let's say, the Philippines. And let's say they go to an Alice Guo, is she a Filipino citizen? Well, purportedly she was, but she actually apparently is not, right? Supposedly it goes to an Alice Guo who's now going to invest that. And once it goes to, let's say, maybe not Alice, maybe let's say a Filipino person. Once that money goes to a Filipino person, legally speaking, that's no longer Chinese money. That becomes Filipino money. It now transforms itself. That is the flexibility behind it. Once it's transformed itself, it can now be invested in, let's say, legal businesses in the Philippines, let's say land, agriculture, pig farming, according to Alice Go. And then when it's now pig farming, it's now disconnected from, let's say, the potential reach of, let's say, Beijing, or in this particular case, the Chinese president.
Now, would it
for me, that's a distinction.
Would it be fair to say that all of the money that went into POGOs, that invested in POGOs, is flexible capital?
Yes, for sure. I made this argument. In fact, this was my argument in 2020. POGOs were online gambling was basically the prime example of flexible capital for me. And it's not exactly, even though online gambling is the main avenue, there's research right now on the relationship between online gambling, scam compounds, cryptocurrency hubs, fentanyl, drugs, for instance, and then you have like sex workers, you have like wildlife farming. basically all this like very dirty illegal enterprises all coming together, fueled by scam compounds. And arms smuggling. Some of them go to terrorism even. It's insane.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask that as a follow-up question. Did the flexible capital that led to POGOs necessarily lead to all these scams? I mean, regardless of what the business model for POGOs would have been, it was really, they were just looking for all sorts of opportunities, and unfortunately, many of the opportunities are dirty in dirty businesses.
Yes. Yeah, I think it necessarily leads to dirty businesses. In this particular case, scams, mainly because it's economic activity outside the regulation of any government or any state.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it is precisely because it is illegal that this type of capital can find profitability, number one. But number two, it can actually hide itself from, let's say, potential legal jurisdiction or regulation.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular case, online gambling in the Philippines is considered to be legal,
mm-hmm.
and that's actually it's always been illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, it's always been legal,
mm-hmm.
and therefore that's actually made it that allowed the online gambling companies to hide itself from the Chinese government.
Mm-hmm. You wrote a really thought-provoking paper or commentary for The Diplomat. It came out a few days ago. And among other things, you asked just how big is the online gaming industry in the Philippines. No? And you take issue with a number that the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Task Force has been throwing around. In fact, I did interview the spokesman of the commission, and he gave me an even higher number. I think something like 402.
I'm sorry, I got disconnected. Do you mind saying it again?
Not at all, no? So I wanted to talk about just this particular number that the commission has been throwing around, and it's actually higher than what you said in your commentary, which was 300. I think it's about 400 now, illegal POGOs. But there's another number from PAGCOR, which is the one that gives the license to the POGOs. And it's a much lower number. Overall, only 200-something plus. So right now, there are only 84 active. So you're only looking at maybe 180 or so that could be possibly classified as illegal POGOs. How do we make sense of this? What's really an issue here, this issue of measurement?
I think the biggest problem here is there's really no clear standardization of measuring, right? Mm-hmm. Whether we're talking about the Presidential Anti-Organized Commission or whether we're talking about PAGCOR. We know during the Duterte administration, it was centralized. And I've actually tried to measure this in my own way. So PAGCOR gives you one number. Mm-hmm. The Office of the President during Duterte gives you another number, gives you money, gives you some amount of money that's supposed to be involved. And, we know that there are many other indicators to sort of talk about the illegal, like, online gambling companies. So I basically pointed out at the end of the commentary, you have a lot of, like, adjacent businesses in addition to illegal laborers moving into the Philippines during Duterte. We know that those things are much, much higher. Mm-hmm. Now, my issue with the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission, I've seen that number being thrown around in the media. Mm-hmm. I've seen the 400, but they said 400 after I published an op-ed, so it was too late for me to include it. Mm-hmm. The latest one was 300. Mm-hmm. And writing that paper, actually, it was inspired from a friend of mine because I was in Thailand with the US IP group, and we were given we were sort of like launching the paper in front of a Thai audience. Okay. And then one of my friends, he's a member of the UN Commission on sort of like on criminal task force. His name is John. I forgot his last name, but I'm gonna send this to him later, and then he can correct me. He launched a question when I was in the panel. He was like, "Well, the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission said it's a much higher number. How do you reconcile that?" Mm-hmm. And then I think logically speaking, I thought about what's the process of, let's say, how do they come up with the number. The issue with how they basically like come up with the number, as what I said in the commentary, is they basically count the number of times they've actually stopped a POGO, an illegal POGO operation. And while that is good, we still don't have it does not create what you call a standardized way of measuring the scale and sort of the degree of POGO operations. PAGCOR, I would say I have a lot of issues with PAGCOR since the Duterte administration. I think the problem with PAGCOR is that they even suffer from a worse problem. They suffer from the worst problem that their data is not transparent, and then it keeps on changing all the time. The data in PAGCOR hasn't been transparent for the longest time, but even during Duterte, it was definitely not transparent when it comes to paying taxes, or let's say how do they register the labor. It wasn't transparent at all. They do give you a number, but that number keeps changing because they look at new registration left and right, and then they accept. Some of them go away, so it keeps changing. The Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission, the problem with them is that, of course, they're incentivized to catch this illegal POGOs, and they're incentivized to broadcast it in the media, and that's a good thing. At the same time, I don't think it should encourage us to say that, oh, actually, online gambling is worse right now. I don't think that's the case. We need to marry these numbers with other indicators. And in my study of other indicators, whether it's the number of, let's say, companies that are linked to the supply chain of POGO operations or scam compounds, or it's a number of illegal, like, what do you call this, like laborers in the Philippines. Both of those numbers have gone down considerably during Marcos. So based on those things, and amongst others, the study of, let's say, scam compounds in Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, the worst ones are really Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. In fact, in our circles, in our scam circles, we call Cambodia. So the study of, let's say, Cambodia, we know that it's those three countries are sort of the centers of it. Right. Now they may be moving, they may be going somewhere else. So right now we found them in Abu Dhabi, we found them in Peru, we found them in like literally different parts of the world. Yet one several positive things about Marcos is that actually these things were reversed to some degree. And maybe that's not because of Marcos, that's because of the pandemic. But nonetheless, give kudos to Marcos for not continuing this trend, at least not completely.
Yeah, so that's one of the main points in your commentary, right? That while the news might be full of POGO raids and so on, the problem taken together is actually smaller, or might be smaller, because, well, of the pandemic, the move to elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and the drop in the number of workers hired, and so on.
Oh, John, I just want to give some notes about my fieldwork. So when I was doing fieldwork in the POGO, when I was doing fieldwork on the online gambling POGOs during Duterte, one thing that many of the police officials used to do before is that when they do get the workers, when they raid workers, they raid a certain office. In some cases, during Duterte, especially when it was not transparent, they end up auctioning many of the workers back into the companies. So they auction it back. That's how they make money. Then usually the programmers or sort of high-skilled Chinese laborers are the most expensive. Then sometimes the relatively good-looking women are also expensive. Then when it comes to sort of like the workers who are sick, or the workers who are like seemingly not productive, they're cheaper. But if no one buys them in the end, many of this, like I'm not gonna name people, but they were officials of the Bureau of Immigration at that time during Duterte. Many of the people in the Bureau of Immigration, they end up having a media announcement that, oh my God, we actually caught like 36 workers. This is after auctioning the workers back to the companies.
So when you say they auction, you're referring to law enforcement officials, government officials.
Government officials auctioning workers to basically like the companies back. So when certain companies get raided, they end up, let's say, auctioning the workers back. In some cases, they auction the same workers back to the same company. Yeah. Now, why are certain companies raided? A lot of different factors. One factor is that they ended up not paying the Duterte administration for their rent. The other is that they ended up having a squabble with sort of like the Michael Yang group, which is the central sort of like I would say criminal enterprise during the Duterte. We have to remember many of the online gambling operations during the Duterte. The central group was really the Michael Yang group. That's really they were really the gatekeepers of like all the online gambling operations. Everybody else from the say the 200 to 300 to 500 companies that really went there, or maybe 1,000 even. We have to remember the unregistered POGOs that were borrowing the legal POGOs, like legal jurisdiction. They were basically paying rent to sort of, let's say, Michael Yang and Rodrigo Duterte at that time. Now, if they don't end up paying rent or they have a squabble, then that's when the police comes in and sort of like shuts them down. Or if the Chinese government demands some action, then the government ends up like picking some POGO groups to sort of like go after to make it appear they're doing something.
Is there a gatekeeper today?
It's hard. I simply because of, I hope you understand. I'm less inclined to say who it. Sure. I'm researching this right now. I have an idea, but simply because of the nature of sort of like this issue right now, I'm less keen on saying it, but I'm open to saying it in the future. I also would say that because of like my study of these operations, the scale right now is much smaller. Yeah. I think what we have to remember during the 30 is that in as big as it was, we never really knew how big it was. Because it was really big, but we saw, like, I remember in 2019, John, I lumaki ako sa Metro Manila. I grew up eating Southern Chinese food, but then I remember in 2019, my God, it was full of Northern Chinese food. Or I can understand Hokkien. My mom is like a Filipino Chinese like Hokkien speaker, but then my God, I know what like Southern Chinese food is. When in 2019, 2018, when I come back to like Metro Manila, it was full of Northern Chinese food. Literally, such a different place in Makati City. And that's actually another point. Many of these like restaurants or businesses, they usually are good indicators for money laundering. That now I don't see the same scale right now in Metro Manila. We never knew how big it was during the 30. I would say it's much bigger than we actually thought.
Dr. Camba, I have so many more questions, but we only have time for maybe one more. One other very interesting thing that you raised in your commentary in The Diplomat is that you said that there are fewer POGOs or illegal POGOs right now, and the ones that remain, you say, are those associated with the Marcos administration. And you pointed to the elephant in the room, or by Ross Boulevard, or in Cavite rather, the Remulla property which has been sold. Can you expound on that?
So I'm just gonna put a caveat that I'm still researching this. It's really hard to find public data, but we know that the Remulla property has been sold to supposedly the Oriental group. If I'm not mistaken, I was actually talking to a friend of mine. So the Wong family, right? So the Wong family. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who went to and now when I was growing up in the Philippines, I have a lot of friends in Xavier. So I'm familiar with the Xavier group, the Xavier networks, but that's actually a different network from the this like, I think it's St. Jude. I think Wong comes from either St. Jude or Grace Christian, one of those schools. Okay. One of the other Chinese schools. Okay. And so the father, as we know, the father of like these two younger Wongs who are probably my age. They actually go back to supposed to be one of the largest casino investors in Southeast Asia. And now we know they're involved, at least from like supposedly announcements and documents, etc. Now, I can't really speculate as to, or rather, I'm still researching who's really involved in the supposedly online gambling sector during Marcos. But I also do know, especially in the context of, let's say, researching online gambling during let's say Arroyo and during like Aquino, we know that many of these groups and organizations that have actually started during Arroyo and Aquino, and we know that during the 30 he basically turned this into a major economic sector. He basically blew it up, and it became extremely big, right? Now, one of the I was able to interview the late Bobby Ongpin actually before he passed away, and one of the things he said was like, okay, he was afraid of, let's say, opening the sector to, let's say, PRC investors, partially because of he knows the scale of the operations and the criminality involved. He said that. And if you talk to other people who actually knew him, they would say the same thing. But one other thing he told me was like, he knew that the groups in the Philippines, they did not want the sector to actually open up exponentially, because it is precisely because of the covertness of the sector that keeps the groups safe at the moment or in the meantime. If you make the sector too big, it creates too much backlash. And if it creates too much backlash, it creates the same sort of problems that basically the Duterte people grappled with in 2019 and 2020. So again, I'm not really answering your question, apologies, but I hope you understand, given the scale of this public conversation, it's hard to say. But I'm more than happy to talk to you about this another time for your GTalk report probably. And then, I can tell you what I know and what my data tells me.
All right. Maybe just one last question, if I can. So do you think President Marcos Jr. will announce an outright ban?
Most probably, I don't think he would. I actually don't think he would do anything. I think now, I hope he does something. I hope. I mean, I in 2022 I wrote about how Marcos should actually ban this online gambling. Nothing happened in Nikkei Asia 2023. I think. I think what Marcos is doing right now is what you call the perfect medium, which is like the best case for any politician. He hasn't really supported expanding POGOs simply because he disallowed new POGOs from coming in. Yet at the same time, he actually maintains the continuation of previously existing POGO operations, specifically the ones that survived the pandemic. And what's interesting is that the ones that actually left, this is another tidbit, John, the online gambling firms that basically closed shop during the pandemic and left the Philippines were largely online gambling firms that entered the Philippines in 2016 and 2017. So the ones that remain in the Philippines right now, they were actually online gambling operations that have been in the Philippines for quite some time, since the early 2000s. These are actually more legacy online gambling companies that are operating in the Philippines and actually operating somewhere else. So I would speculate that the ones that remain in the Philippines are more legacy online gambling companies involved with our own criminals in our country, and probably have stronger political linkages than the ones that actually left the country during the pandemic, which in my view are linked to the Duterte administration.
Dr. Alvin Camba, this has been a most fascinating, even chilling, but also most helpful conversation. I do hope that your Chinese friend is in fact safe, even though you have not heard from your friend. Thank you again, and thank you for making time.
Yeah, thank you, John. Have a good day.
And that's it for us today. The next step for engaged citizens, as always, is to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. You can download the Rappler Communities app and join the chat room of your choice. Thank you. This is John Nery. See you in the public square.